The radio crackles. Static. Then silence. Across the English Channel, somewhere over the grey waters between Dover and Calais, a single aircraft cuts through cloud cover at 15,000 feet. The date is August 15, 1940. The pilot's name is James Nicolson. He's 23 years old. His hands grip the control stick of a Hawker Hurricane fighter, and in less than 4 minutes, everything he knows about survival will be tested in ways no training manual could prepare him for. But this story isn't about heroism in the way you've been taught to recognize it. It's about something far more unsettling. The moment when one man realized that dying might be the only way to win. By the summer of 1940, Britain stood alone. France had fallen. The Soviet Union had signed a non-aggression pact with Berlin. The United States remained neutral. And every night, German bombers crossed the Channel, their payload bays filled with high explosives destined for London, Southampton, and Portsmouth. The question wasn't if invasion would come, it was when. But Britain had one invisible advantage. One weapon that couldn't be seen on any radar screen, couldn't be counted in any logbook, and couldn't be manufactured in any factory. It was the weapon of calculated presence. What the German High Command didn't fully understand, what their intelligence officers failed to grasp despite months of reconnaissance, was that the Royal Air Force had learned to make one plane feel like 20, one pilot sound like a squadron, one voice over the radio become an entire battle group. This is the story of how that illusion was built, tested, and in one extraordinary case, perfected by a man who had no idea he was about to become its most lethal embodiment. Let's step back 3 months. May 1940. The evacuation at Dunkirk has just concluded. Over 338,000 Allied troops have been pulled from the beaches under relentless aerial attack. The British Expeditionary Force has survived, but it left behind nearly all its equipment. Tanks, artillery, vehicles, weapons. Britain's army is intact in body, but hollow in capability. Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, commander of RAF Fighter Command, knows what's coming next. The German Luftwaffe will attempt to establish air superiority over the Channel and southern England. Without it, an amphibious invasion is impossible. With it, Britain will fall within weeks. Dowding has a problem. He has roughly 650 operational fighter aircraft. The Luftwaffe has over 2,600, including some of the most advanced bombers and fighters in the world. The Heinkel He-111, the Dornier Do-17, the Messerschmitt Bf-109. On paper it's not a fair fight. But Dowding has something else. Something the German planners didn't account for. He has a network. It begins with a chain of radar stations along the British coast, technology so new that most of the world doesn't yet understand its potential. These stations, codenamed Chain Home, can detect incoming aircraft at ranges exceeding 100 miles. The information flows into filter rooms where plotters, mostly young women from the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, track every aircraft movement on large map tables using wooden tokens. From there, the data moves to sector control rooms, where fighter controllers coordinate responses. These controllers don't just vector pilots toward targets. They choreograph the entire engagement. They decide who climbs, who dives, who breaks radio silence, and critically, who pretends to be more than one aircraft. This is where the invisible weapon begins to take shape. Fighter command doctrine, developed in the late 1930s, emphasized something called tactical radio discipline. Pilots were trained not just to communicate efficiently, but to deceive through communication. A single pilot could, under the right circumstances, mimic the radio chatter of an entire formation. Call signs were rotated. Voices were modulated. Phrases were standardized to create the illusion of multiple units converging simultaneously. The Germans monitored British radio frequencies constantly. Their intelligence officers compiled reports, trying to assess RAF strength by counting distinct call signs, tracking formation patterns, and estimating squadron deployments based on radio traffic. But the British were feeding them a lie. One pilot might use 3 different call signs in a single sortie. A flight of 4 Hurricanes might transmit using the call structure of 12 aircraft. Ground controllers would issue orders to Red Squadron and Blue Squadron, when in reality only Red Squadron existed. Blue was a phantom, a voice without a body, designed to make enemy bomber crews believe they were flying into a hornet's nest. The psychological impact was immediate. Luftwaffe bomber crews, already stressed by the long overwater flights and the constant threat of interception, began reporting encounters with overwhelming British fighter opposition. Debriefing reports from German airfields in occupied France mentioned being swarmed by Hurricanes and Spitfires, even when RAF records showed only a handful of interceptors in the area. This wasn't luck. It was architecture. The British had turned their numerical weakness into a perceptual strength. They'd made scarcity feel like abundance. And by mid-August 1940, as the Battle of Britain entered its most critical phase, this invisible weapon was about to be tested in a way no one anticipated. August 15, 1940. The Luftwaffe launches Adler Tag, Eagle Day. The largest coordinated air assault yet attempted. Over 1,000 aircraft are committed. Bombers targeting airfields, radar stations, and aircraft factories across southern England. Flight Lieutenant James Nicolson is assigned to 249 Squadron, based at Boscombe Down in Wiltshire. His unit flies the Hawker Hurricane Mki, a rugged, reliable fighter with 8.303 Browning machine guns and a top speed of 340 miles per hour. It's slower than the Messerschmitt Bf 109, but more maneuverable at lower altitudes. At 1,430 hours, Nicholson's flight of 3 aircraft is scrambled. The order comes from Sector Control. Intercept a formation of German bombers reported northeast of Southampton, heading inland. Nicholson takes off. His wingmen form up beside him. The afternoon sky is hazy, visibility moderate. They climb to 17,000 feet. The radio traffic is dense. Multiple call signs, overlapping reports, vectors changing every few seconds. To an outside listener, it would sound like dozens of British fighters converging on the same target area. In reality, there are perhaps 15 aircraft airborne across 3 counties. Nicholson's flight turns northeast. They're looking for bombers, Junkers Ju-88s, most likely, escorted by Bf 109 fighters. Then, without warning, Nicholson's aircraft shudders. Cannon fire. 4 20mm shells rip through his Hurricane from behind. One punctures the fuel tank. Another shatters the canopy. A third tears through the instrument panel. The fourth strikes Nicholson in the foot. A Messerschmitt Bf 110, a twin-engine heavy fighter, has dived out of the sun and caught him completely unaware. Nicholson's Hurricane is on fire. Fuel sprays across the cockpit. Flames erupt from the engine cowling and sweep backward, engulfing the fuselage. The heat is immediate and overwhelming. Nicholson can feel his flight suit beginning to melt against his skin. Standard procedure is clear: bail out. At this altitude, he has maybe 10 seconds before the aircraft becomes uncontrollable or explodes. Nicholson reaches for the canopy release. Then he sees it. Directly ahead, maybe 400 yards away, slightly below him, a Junkers Ju-88 bomber. No escort. No evasive maneuvers. Just flying straight and level, completely unaware that a burning British fighter is falling toward it. Nicholson makes a decision. He stays in the cockpit. Ignoring the flames, ignoring the pain in his foot, ignoring the fact that his gloves are now on fire, he pushes the control stick forward. The Hurricane's nose drops. The gun sight reticle drifts onto the Ju-88's fuselage. He opens fire. The 8 Browning machine guns hammer out rounds at 1,200 per minute. Tracer rounds arc across the sky. The Ju-88 shudders. Pieces of aluminum skin peel away from its wings. Smoke begins pouring from one engine. Nicholson holds the trigger. His hands are burning. The cockpit is an inferno. The Ju-88's wing folds upward, then tears away completely. The bomber rolls inverted and begins spinning toward the ground. Only then does Nicholson bail out. He pulls the canopy release, what's left of it, and throws himself backward out of the cockpit. The slipstream tears him away from the aircraft. He tumbles through the air, pulling the ripcord. The parachute deploys. As he drifts downward, suspended beneath the white silk canopy, he looks up and watches his Hurricane disintegrate in midair. But here's what makes this moment extraordinary, what transforms it from an act of individual courage into something that resonates across the entire structure of the Battle of Britain. Nicholson wasn't just staying in the aircraft to shoot down one bomber. He was staying in the fight to maintain the illusion. Here's what the German bomber crews heard over their radios during that engagement. Multiple British call signs. Overlapping transmissions. Reports of bandits intercepted, targets destroyed, reforming at Angels 2-0. The usual chaos of air combat, amplified by the British doctrine of deliberate radio saturation. And then, cutting through the static, one Hurricane staying engaged when it should have disengaged. One pilot firing when he should have been fleeing. One aircraft, fully ablaze, still maneuvering to attack. The psychological impact wasn't just on the crew of the Ju-88 that Nicholson shot down. It was on every German aircrew monitoring that frequency. Because what Nicholson did, intentionally or not, was prove the British narrative. 4 weeks, Luftwaffe intelligence had been receiving reports of fanatical British resistance, of pilots who refused to disengage, of fighters that seemed to multiply impossibly in combat. Some German analysts dismissed these reports as exaggeration, stress and fear distorting perception. But when a pilot remains in a burning aircraft to press an attack, when someone chooses death over withdrawal, it validates every exaggerated claim. Makes the phantom squadrons real. It turns the illusion of overwhelming opposition into something unkillable, something beyond reason. This is the invisible weapon at its most refined. It's not about the technology, the radios, the radar, the ground control. It's about the human amplifier. The individual who, through action, makes the entire system credible. Nicolson survived. He landed by parachute in a field near Southampton, severely burned but conscious. He was admitted to hospital and spent months recovering from his injuries. For his actions, he was awarded the Victoria Cross, the only fighter command pilot to receive Britain's highest military honor during the Battle of Britain. But the real impact of that afternoon wasn't measured in medals. It was measured in German operational reports over the following weeks. Luftwaffe bomber formations began requesting heavier fighter escort. Raid planning became more conservative. Crews reported increased stress and requests for rotation out of channel operations rose sharply. German intelligence assessments of RAF strength were revised upward, not because the British had more aircraft, but because the behavior of British pilots suggested reserves that didn't exist. One man. One burning aircraft. One decision to stay in the fight 4 seconds longer than survival required. And the entire calculus of the battle shifted, just slightly in Britain's favor. Let's zoom out and examine the larger structure. The Battle of Britain lasted from July to October 1940. By the end, the Luftwaffe had lost approximately 1,900 aircraft. The RAF lost around 1,500. But the critical metric wasn't aircraft destroyed, it was operational capacity preserved. German bomber losses forced a strategic recalculation. Daylight raids became unsustainable. The planned invasion, Operation Sea Lion, was postponed then quietly abandoned. Britain remained unconquered, and that single fact altered the trajectory of the entire war. How much of that outcome was determined by invisible weapons? More than most histories acknowledge. Consider the technical elements. Radar integration. The chain home system wasn't just early warning. It was a force multiplier that let outnumbered defenders position themselves with precision, creating the impression of omnipresence. German bombers couldn't cross the coast without being tracked, and that constant awareness fed the perception of an unbeatable defensive network. Ground-controlled interception. British fighter controllers didn't just direct aircraft, they scripted engagements. They controlled when pilots spoke, what they said, and how formations appeared on German radar. This centralized choreography made small numbers look like large ones. Tactical radio deception. Pilots were trained to manipulate call signs, frequency hopping, and transmission timing to confuse enemy listeners. This wasn't accidental chatter, it was psychological warfare embedded in operational communication. But technology alone doesn't create the effect. You need human beings willing to embody the deception. To make it visceral. To take the abstract concept of making one plane feel like many, and transform it into something German crews could feel in their gut. That's what Nicolson did. And he wasn't alone. There are dozens of documented cases during the Battle of Britain where individual pilots, damaged or outnumbered, chose to stay engaged rather than withdraw. In almost every instance, the tactical value of their continued presence was minimal. They couldn't change the immediate outcome of the engagement. But the psychological value was incalculable. Each instance reinforced the narrative. Each burning aircraft that kept firing, each lone hurricane that refused to disengage, each pilot who radioed, still in the fight, when logic said they should be dead, all of it fed the German perception that they were facing something beyond normal military opposition. And perception in war dictates behavior. Bomber crews who believe they're flying into overwhelming defenses fly more conservatively. They drop ordnance early. They abort runs. They demand fighter escort that stretches Luftwaffe resources thinner. Fighter pilots who believe they're outnumbered disengage sooner. They conserve ammunition. They second-guess their tactical decisions. None of this shows up in casualty reports or bomb damage assessments. But it shapes outcomes more decisively than almost any physical weapon. This is the central lesson of invisible warfare. The most effective weapons are the ones that change what the enemy thinks is possible. But there's a darker dimension to this story. Creating an illusion of strength requires people willing to become the illusion. And that means asking individuals to take risks that, by any rational calculation, shouldn't be taken. Nicolson's burns were severe. third degree across his hands, face and legs. He endured multiple surgeries and spent the better part of a year in recovery. He returned to operational flying but never fully recovered from his injuries. After the war, he continued to serve in the RAF, eventually rising to the rank of wing commander. He died in 1945 when his transport aircraft disappeared over the Bay of Bengal. He was 29 years old. How do we account for that? The utilitarian calculus is straightforward. Nicholson's 4 extra seconds in combat contributed to a strategic victory that saved thousands, perhaps millions, of lives. The British mainland was never invaded. The war continued. Eventually the Allies won. But utilitarian calculus doesn't capture the moral weight of asking someone to burn for an illusion. Because that's ultimately what happened. Nicholson didn't stay in his aircraft because the Ju-88 he shot down was strategically critical. He stayed because, in that moment, breaking off would have broken the spell. It would have revealed the truth, that the RAF was stretched thin, that every aircraft mattered, that British fighters couldn't afford to press hopeless attacks. So he burned instead. And the illusion held. This is the price of invisible weapons. They're efficient. They're elegant. They're devastatingly effective at reshaping the battlefield without firing a shot, or by firing just a few more shots than survival allows. But they demand something traditional weapons don't. They demand that people become symbols instead of soldiers. Every fighter pilot who stayed in a doomed engagement, every radio operator who transmitted phantom call signs, every ground controller who scripted deceptions, they weren't just fighting a battle. They were performing a battle, staging a theater of overwhelming force for an audience of enemy analysts who would file reports, revise estimates, and ultimately convince their superiors that Britain couldn't be beaten. And the performance required blood. 85 years later, we tell the story of the Battle of Britain as a triumph of courage and technological innovation. We talk about the Spitfire and the Hurricane. We remember the pilots, the few, who stood between Britain and invasion. All of that is true. But it's not complete. What we often miss is the underlying structure, the invisible weapons that made British resistance credible. The radar, the radio deception, the ground control network, and most critically, the willingness of individuals to embody a fiction that was more powerful than any truth. Because that's the unsettling core of this story. The most effective weapon isn't always the one that kills the most enemies. Sometimes it's the one that makes the enemy believe they can't win. And creating that belief doesn't require superior numbers, better technology, or even tactical brilliance. It requires a few people willing to stay in the fire when every rational instinct screams at them to jump. James Nicolson stayed. He burned. He lived long enough to receive his medal, return to duty, and eventually disappear over an empty ocean. The German High Command postponed Operation Sea Lion on September 17, 1940. They cited unsustainable losses and continued RAF resistance. They never knew that much of what they were seeing, what they thought they were fighting, was smoke and mirrors held together by young men who decided that dying while maintaining an illusion was better than surviving and revealing the truth. That's not the war story we want to hear. But it might be the one we need to understand. Because the lesson isn't about heroism. It's about the terrifying efficiency of weapons you can't see, and the human cost of wielding them well. The radio crackles. Static. Then silence. Somewhere over the channel, a single aircraft cuts through cloud cover. And an entire enemy air force hesitates.